and I will be talking about design patterns today. I know you guys talked about some cool technologies, but I think I'm bringing something closer to home here on design patterns. Design patterns might sound a little bit scary, but one thing you'll realize is a lot of what you've been using in JavaScript and in any other languages you use, design patterns are all over the place. You might have not have implemented them yourselves, but you've definitely used the product of a design pattern usually. And so in this presentation, I'm just going to walk you through it. I've gone through some texts, read through some of the books. I'll give you kind of like what I gather is the overall definition that I got from it, the benefits of design patterns. Then I'll just kind of break down the 3 basic types of design patterns that I found in the Gang of 4 book, which is kind of like the iconic text about design patterns. Then we'll walk through 3 examples of the one relating to each of the types of design patterns that I've gone through. And then we'll just show off some resources that I found that were really useful for myself. So yeah. So what is it? Design patterns, I think some of the texts, they don't like formally say like, this is what a design pattern is, like some short, succinct like definition. But this is kind of like the best way I can put it in like 2 sentences. It's a reusable solution that applies to a common problem that you'll have when you're designing software. Not to say that like every problem that you'll have while designing your software can be solved by a pattern, but that's in certain situations, depending on the team where you're working on, a pattern might apply to the problem that you're having. And it's part of it is recognizing that a pattern is useful there. And part of that is your team communicating and deciding on that, or a lot of it is from experience. The kind of like the one thing I think a lot of books stress is that a design pattern isn't an answer. It's a template. It's a very formal thing. Usually there's a really descriptive name that kind of describes how it's implemented or what it's supposed to do. There's a problem that it addresses. There are use cases for when this design pattern applies. Kind of like the trade-offs that you make when you decide to use a particular pattern. And that's kind of like the biggest part. There are trade-offs. You can't just think like, I'm going to use this design pattern, it's going to solve everything. No, there are trade-offs. Another pattern might work, but it might reveal a certain problem for yourself. But those are kind of the things that I found like describe a design pattern. But if I had to put it into 2 sentences, this would be it. So that's kind of the definition of design patterns. So I said they're not kind of the answer to everything, but they are beneficial in kind of like these 3 points that I found. There's a certain degree of certainty that it works. Design patterns aren't new. They're something that's been in the process of being studied, people researching these things for like years. And like for the Gang of 4 book, that came out in 1995. So that's 20 years ago, right, at this point. And like patterns have been used before that, but that was kind of like the first time that it was really documented. So the degree of certainty that it works because people have used it and tested it over time, and it still works now. They're generalized in such a way that it applies in different languages. You can use it in JavaScript. It's definitely used in JavaScript. Java uses it. Like Gang of 4 talks about object-oriented design. So usually, like if you find examples online, they're usually on Java. And then for technologists like ourselves, when we're working a project, when we're in a meeting, it helps a lot when you know what someone else is talking about when they talk about a certain pattern. They say, hey, this is an iterator, or we're going to use the observer pattern. Like, now you know, because there's a shared term. You all have a good understanding of what it is. You don't have to just write it in words. We're going to do this. Like, these are the 10 lines that describe it. You know. So kind of, I've been just kind of talking about how design patterns are useful, but still kind of vague here. But kind of from a basic point of view, there are 3 types. There's creational, structural, and behavioral. Creational, as you can tell, probably it's about creating objects and the creation of objects and how you make objects. Structural is more along the lines of like, I guess, how you build up the object, how you define the relationships between classes and objects in different ways. And behavioral is kind of like how do different objects and classes interact and communicate with each other. I think for myself, structural and behavioral kind of still like, it sounded the same to me, but when you like look at examples of it, it kind of like they're pretty clear if you go through the different patterns. And so in the kind of like the next 3 slides, I'm just gonna walk you through like one pattern that relates to each of these 3 types of design patterns. And so the first one we have is the Singleton pattern. It's nice to note, I think in our kind of like early, beginning, we like probably did an example that had something that was really closed off. I don't think we ever called it a Singleton pattern, but if you look at it, like, it makes sense why it's called a Singleton pattern here. Whenever this object is like instantiated, it's only ever made one time. So it gets called right off the bat once the Singleton is made. And so now you have a Singleton object. And as you can see here, you have instance equals singleton.getInstance, one instance of it, and then you create a second instance variable. But if you check the 2 types, they're actually the same object. Because as you can see right here, when you try making a new object, it checks that if the instance is null or is undefined or not. And as you can see, once it gets initiated, it's not undefined anymore. And so what you have here is always one object. And it's really useful for particular cases where you might have, you want a shared state. You want to have like some closed off variable that everyone kind of shares, but you don't want to create like 10 different objects so that like you have to worry about like different states. So it does solve that particular problem. But at the same time, there are certain cons to it. I think I found one of the big problems is like testing a Singleton object where since you can see like everything is sharing the same data, unit testing it can be actually really difficult because you're basing it on one object and now all your tests actually depend on previous tests. And so that's a bit of an issue. There's various trade-offs to different design patterns, like I said earlier. So this is the Singleton design pattern. So this is the next pattern, structural. And this one is called the adapter. I think the best way I can describe the adapter is imagine you have a client who makes use of your API and uses a method called request all the time. Now you created it, your company is growing, it's expanding, and you like decided you're going to improve your software and you're going to do some new thing and you're going to make a modification to your API. But you don't want to screw it up with the client. So you reveal it in such a way that they can still use the old request method that you have and just like not even know that this implementation was in place. So in this example, you have a shipping object, which is actually the old request method. And then you decide you're going to make a new one called the modify shipping object function here. And then you have this piece called the adapter, so kind of like a middle layer that reveals the original function. So as you can see, it returns a request function so that the client who used to use your request method in the shipping doesn't recognize that something has changed. All they know is that they still can use the request method and they don't know something's happening in place. And so it's kind of like chaining interfaces and making sure that things work the way it used to. So one of the problems that we see here is oftentimes it's not as simple. It might actually be like a very long chain, and that kind of maybe screws up the code base. You're adding a lot more there, and so that's kind of like the disadvantages I've found through the adapter pattern. There's probably a lot more, but I think that was just kind of some of the things I found. And then the final one, I know it's a source of contention here about using iterators in our group. The Iterator design pattern, we use it very often. All our array methods, we do for eaches, and it makes it very easy for us to use functions and apply them onto the things we're looping through. But essentially, look, this is the Iterator. It's pretty, actually the best thing is I tried looking for disadvantages about the Iterator, and I couldn't find a big disadvantage at all. It's kind of the general thing was like, it is accepted. Most people use it, and it's a good thing. So you have the Iterator, and there's, most iterators are made with a first, a next, has next. The reset is to reset it so that you can always go back from the start. And each method that takes a callback and applies the callback onto the item, the item in that collection. But essentially, if you look inside of it, it's just using a for loop, right? And so it just kind of abstracts away a certain amount of the process of writing this for loop every time. You can still do it if you want, as in this example. And so this person is doing that. They're just console logging the item after going through the collection. They pass it through right there. Or if they want it, they can just do a dot each on each of the items and console log it from there. And so that's the iterator pattern. And it's actually really cool. You know, we don't think about it like that. We just kind of take it as it is and we just use it. Yeah, so those are 3 patterns. There's a lot more patterns. I only talked about 3. They're pretty fun to learn about, and like I think part of it is like looking at a problem and recognizing like, oh wow, this is a certain pattern. I didn't ever like appreciate that it was used. Yeah, and so these are kind of the resources I had. The Gang of 4. I kind of like only went through part of it. It's pretty easy to read, but I actually recommend the Head First Design Patterns book. I think they really do like a great job of the showing images and like showing it. It's like much easier to read through. And the next 2, maybe more general on like JavaScript patterns, but they definitely touch on design patterns as well. So yeah, thank you.